Or linear history. Before empires measured themselves in chronicles and kings, there were systems. The Harappan civilization did not collapse in a single moment. There was no sudden catastrophe, no singular event. It dissolved, gradually, like a system approaching the limits of its own stability. Mohenjo-Daro was not simply a city built in stone. It was a living network. Water flowed through engineered channels. Trade connected distant regions. Urban geometry followed rules of proportion and repetition. Rhythm emerged from the interaction of countless human decisions. Order did not come from centralized control. It emerged from coordination, from feedback, from balance. And yet, every complex system carries internal thresholds. Small perturbations accumulate. Feedback's slow. Resilience fades long before collapse becomes visible. What disappears first is never the structure. Walls remain. Streets persist. Grids endure. What disappears first is stability. He designs the whole. Order is not imposed. It emerges from interaction, from repetition, from feedback. The Harappan city functioned like an organism. Its form was not static. It adapted to climate, trade, population, and flow. Water systems adjusted to seasonal rhythms. Urban layouts followed modular rules rather than rigid plans. Local decisions propagated through the network.
Mathematics seeks constants, fixed points in a changing world, anchors of stability within motion. Constants allow us to measure, to predict, to compress reality into symbols. But complex systems resist linear capture. They do not evolve smoothly. They oscillate, they bifurcate, they jump between regimes. A small variation in parameters can transform order into chaos. What appears stable for long periods can suddenly become unstable. The Feigenbaum constant reveals the hidden geometry of this transition, a universal ratio governing how systems double their behavior, how order fractures into chaos through repeated bifurcations. Euler's number governs a different boundary. Growth and decay, accumulation and dissipation, from populations to finance, from chemistry to networks. These constants do not describe objects. They describe processes. Yet even these universal numbers encounter limits. There are regions where equations no longer stabilize, where prediction loses resolution, where complexity feeds on itself. Beyond this point, the system becomes unsustainable. Not broken, not destroyed, but mathematically uncontained. This boundary cannot always be expressed as a number. Sometimes it appears as a transition, sometimes as divergence, sometimes as indeterminacy. Here we encounter a symbolic constant of collapse, not a value to be calculated, but a limit to be acknowledged. The moment when description fails, and the system must change scale. Narration. The Millennium Problems are not isolated puzzles. They are not technical curiosities reserved for specialists. They are mirrors. Each one reflects a boundary, a point where our most powerful models hesitate. Navier-Stokes exposes turbulence, a regime where smooth equations dissolve into vortices, where prediction fragments into flow. At small scales, motion appears ordered. At larger scales, coherence breaks. Energy cascades, patterns emerge, then vanish. Here, the problem is not ignorance. It is sensitivity. Tiny uncertainties amplify until control becomes impossible. P versus NP reveals a different frontier. The limits of computation. The moment when deciding becomes harder than verifying. As systems grow in size and interdependence, solutions may exist, but finding them becomes impractical. Complexity outpaces governance. Decision lags behind consequence. The Riemann hypothesis points inward, toward hidden structure, toward patterns embedded beneath apparent randomness. Prime numbers appear chaotic, yet their distribution follows deep, unseen regularities. Stability hides inside disorder. Each millennium problem marks a boundary between what can be predicted and what must be navigated. Between control and emergence, civilizations encounter the same frontier. As networks expand, as flows accelerate, as complexity accumulates, prediction weakens, decisions fragment, hidden instabilities surface. The question is no longer whether systems fail, but how they cross their limits. Collapse is not the end of a system. It is not disappearance. It is not erasure. Collapse is integration at another scale. When a system exceeds its capacity to sustain its current form, it does not simply break. It reorganizes. The Harappan civilization did not vanish from history. Its cities emptied, its grids dissolved, its visible structures faded, but its people remained. Practices migrated, knowledge diffused, cultural patterns redistributed across regions. Ecological pressures reshaped economies. Trade routes shifted. Social organization adapted to new constraints. This is how complex systems survive. Not by preserving form, but by transforming function. At one scale, the system collapses. At another, it integrates. What once appeared as a unified structure re-emerges as a network of smaller, more flexible configurations. Meaning does not disappear. Value does not vanish. What collapses is not meaning, but form. And in that transformation, new patterns become possible. Mathematics shows us limits. The points where equations lose precision, where prediction dissolves, where certainty ends. History shows us consequences. What happens when societies ignore thresholds, when complexity accelerates beyond coherence, when stability fades long before collapse becomes visible? Between mathematics and history lies consciousness. The only system capable of observing itself. The only system that can recognize its own limits, while still operating within them. To understand systems is not to prevent collapse. Collapse is inevitable in complex structures. Forms exhaust themselves. Scales change. The task is not control, but navigation. To recognize when a system must transform, when integration must replace preservation, when rigidity must give way to adaptation. Every civilization follows this arc. Every theory, every structure built to last. Systems do not fail because they are weak, but because they reach the limits of their form. And at those limits, a constant appears. Not always as a number. Sometimes as a threshold. Sometimes as a decision. Sometimes as collapse. Every system carries its own constant of collapse. What remains, when limits are reached, is not an answer, but a responsibility. Understanding complex systems demands more than explanation. It requires participation, structure, method. This work is not presented as a finished model, nor as a closed theory. It is an active research process, built in layers, tested through failure, refined through integration. The ideas explored here are not meant to remain isolated. They are meant to be formalized, to be challenged, to be developed collectively. As this channel grows, and as its audience reaches the necessary scale and maturity, parts of the research infrastructure will be shared. Selected repositories will be opened, not as archives, not as discussion spaces, but as environments for structured scientific work. Collaboration will be guided by contribution, by rigor, by respect for method and documentation. Everything developed within these spaces will be transformed into formal material, papers, preprints, models, simulations, verifiable results. This is not an invitation to agree. It is an invitation to work. To those who recognize limits not as barriers, but as signals. To those willing to navigate uncertainty without simplifying it. The future of complex systems will not be decided by control, but by integration. Every system, no matter how stable it appears, is born with an internal measure of tension. A point not written in its blueprints, but embedded in its structure. This constant is not always numerical. It cannot always be calculated, predicted, or optimized away. Sometimes it appears as a threshold. Sometimes as a delay. Sometimes as a growing mismatch between scale and control. In physical systems, it emerges as turbulence, as instability, as phase transition. In mathematical systems, it appears as undecidability, as divergence, as problems that resist closure. In biological systems, it manifests as exhaustion, as mutation, as the need to reorganize or perish. In civilizations, it takes the form of overextension, rigidity, loss of adaptive feedback. The constant of collapse is not a flaw. It is a consequence of complexity. Systems do not collapse because they are poorly designed, but because design itself has limits. As interaction grows, as connections multiply, As scale increases, the cost of maintaining coherence rises. Eventually, the system reaches a point where preservation becomes more expensive than transformation. That point is its constant of collapse. Collapse, then, is not failure. It is accounting, a rebalancing between structure and possibility. A signal that integration must replace accumulation. That adaptation must replace control. Every system carries this constant because no system is infinite. No structure can expand without consequence. No order can persist unchanged across scales. To understand a system is not to eliminate its constant of collapse, but to recognize it, to anticipate it, and to navigate the transition it demands. Those who ignore it mistake stability for permanence. Those who understand it recognize collapse as the precondition for new forms of order. Every system carries its own constant of collapse because every system, sooner or later, must change the way it exists.